Pus dripped from his ear with a sound like someone dropping raw meat on the floor. Francis II wasn't just rotting. He stank so badly that streaks of mold, caused by the steam emanating from his inflamed head, hung from the bedroom ceiling. Servants smeared cow dung under their noses to dull the smell. But even that didn't help. One of the guards was blinded in one eye after a squirt splashed directly onto his face while changing a bandage.
The chroniclers of June 16th, 1560, record this incident without a doubt.
By June, the infection had spread far beyond the ear. Crimson, swollen ulcers began to emerge from the royals' once soft skin. The cheek and neck were particularly affected. The pus flowed from them so profusely that the royal shirts had to be changed several times a day, though in reality they were more often simply burned. At the first signs of necrosis, doctors claimed that these were excess fluids leaving the body and opened the inflamed areas right before the courtier's eyes. With tweezers without any anesthesia, they pulled out chunks of necrotic flesh, immersing them in the disgusting aroma of rotten meat and sour moisture. Sometimes black clots emerged from the wounds, steaming like rotting mud in a swamp. On July 2nd, 1560, Francis summoned the cook and ordered him to prepare a special dessert for his sister, Margaret of Valois, which, according to the king himself, was to include a discharge from the ear, a little vinegar, and wine syrup. One of his confidants, hearing this order, burst into tears right there in the hall. He was taken away. The smell of decay was now a part of everyday life in the castle. It had permeated the walls, ceilings, and tapestries. No amount of herbs or incense could eradicate it. 16-year-old Francis, aware of his appearance, began hiding his face behind rags of dirty cloth. His hair fell out in clumps, especially on the side where the infection was growing. Black spots appeared on his skin, initially mistaken for pigmentation, and later for signs of internal decay. One of the court counts later recalled seeing part of the king's cheek begin to fall off, leaving pinkish-yellow flesh beneath a layer of black crust. Francis's bed wasn't big enough. He ruined 3 sheets a night, and not just with the pus. Sometimes the sores would crack with a crunching sound, and the liquid would drip onto the mattress. One of the mattresses had to be buried right in the courtyard. According to the servants, it had begun to breathe steam. The rats were the first to sense this. Servants began noticing their presence near the chambers as early as May, but by midsummer the situation had spiraled out of control. A servant named Gaetan wrote in the chronicles, 56 rats were counted near the Grand Duke's bed. Francis, losing his mind, began talking to them. On the morning of July 19th, he ordered that the court dogs not be fed, so that the rats could more easily climb onto the pillows. Servants began refusing to work. New ones were recruited from nearby villages with promises of money, clothing, and debt forgiveness. Some stayed only a day, after which they fled, claiming they had seen the king's ear breathing. All this time, Francis himself was slowly, painfully dying, his stinking, shaking body immersed in a viscous stench where rags were changed more often than prayers were said. All that remained regal was the crown he no longer wore and the signatures he left with an ink stain and a pus stain next to them. His signatures were truly beginning to stink. When a maid accidentally brushed the king's ear with her shirt sleeve, a crust of pus, hard as baked resin, sloughed off his scalp. It fell to the floor with a distinctive pop, leaving a hole in his skin from which a murky stream immediately began to flow. The servant at the door immediately vomited, and the girl herself became hysterical and never spoke again. This happened on June 4th, 1560, the day that records began to be kept of the number of palace guests who fainted simply from being near the body of Francis II. The infection, which had begun as a simple earache, had by this point spread to the entire left side of the skull. The upper cheekbone was covered in swollen, translucent ulcers, oozing pus mixed with blood. When they burst, the fabric of the clothes stuck to the skin and tore off along with it. The headdress, a feathered beret, was forbidden to wear. Fungal growths had begun to form on it, absorbing the stench. One of the doctors kept it in a separate box for further study. but burned it a few days later because maggots had begun to crawl out of it. The scalp on the infected side lost feeling. Francis picked at it with his fingernails, squeezing out ulcers and picking at scars. He began asking for a metal stylus to scratch his head, an object typically used for writing on wax tablets. It was used and then discarded. After each touch, it became coated with a brownish film and sticky mucus residue. On June 11, 1560, the physician in ordinary ordered that no more sharp objects be given to the king. During one of his attacks, Francis had injured his eye socket.
By June 18th, the smell from the bedroom had spread to the lower floors.
The servants working in the kitchen complained that the food was spoiling quickly and the cheeses were blooming prematurely. Meat dishes began to be sent back. The aroma from the royal chambers was overwhelming even the hunters, accustomed to the scent of blood. One of the cooks left for a monastery. Francis himself became afraid of mirrors. He ordered reflective surfaces removed and hidden and smashed water vessels if he saw his face in them. When walking, he covered his head with a black kerchief, and on particularly difficult days, he donned a woolen hood. Servants dared not look him in the eye. Once he struck a page with a fireplace shovel after noticing him holding his breath from the stench. As June wore on, the king began to develop strange rituals. Every morning, he examined his discharge and ordered his courtiers to record any changes in its color and consistency. These notes were kept in a separate notebook, which was later confiscated and burned. Only one sentence from the archivist's letter survived. The king believed that the viscosity of the pus could predict the fall of states. On June 21st, 1560, while changing the bandage, they discovered that part of the ear had completely fallen off. The bandage itself was blackish green, and the tissue underneath was slimy and blistered. Doctors agreed that bone decomposition had begun. An autopsy would later confirm that the temporal bone had been completely eaten away, and the infection had spread to the base of the skull. Interaction with people became torturous. Francis feared solitude, but he also couldn't stand those close to him. He ordered them to stand close, but with their eyes closed and without breathing. He ordered one of his guards tied up to prevent him from escaping. He forced the young women sent to care for him to kneel for hours, draping their hems around themselves, as if the fabric would absorb the scent. Some women later claimed to feel the king cling to their clothes if he accidentally touched them. Besides the rats, flies appeared in the room. They weren't just buzzing, they were feeding. On particularly hot days, Francis couldn't swat them away, and dozens of dark bite marks remained on his body, especially around his neck. One time, a fly crawled into an open wound behind his ear and didn't leave. 2 days later, a hole with wiggling edges formed in that spot. On June 30th, 1560, a tub of vinegar and lavender was placed in the bedroom, hoping to reduce the stench. But the vinegar began to foam, a reaction occurring in the air itself. The physicians abandoned attempts to cleanse the space and instead began covering the walls with wax sheets. These sheets were changed every 2 days, and when removed, a yellow residue resembling moldy semolina fell off. Francis remained conscious throughout this time. He read, prayed, and wrote instructions, leaving purulent stains on the paper. His notes were later stored in parchment bags, and the guardians wore gloves soaked in turpentine. Some papers had to be destroyed. The ink had bled due to the acid secreted by the pus and sweat. His body became a chemical weapon. By midsummer 1560, it became clear that Francis's illness was no longer limited to physical pain. It had altered his behavior, habits, and even his very perception of himself as a king. On July 7th, courtiers noticed that he was increasingly out in public and increasingly confined to darkened chambers with thickly curtained windows. Light irritated him, and the noise of voices ignited fits of rage. Francis began to avoid touching, but at the same time demanded the constant presence of people nearby. He ordered his servants to stand against the wall for hours without moving, simply to sense that someone else was in the room. If someone fainted from the heat or fatigue, he felt not sympathy, but suspicion. He saw it as an attempt to abandon him. His attitude toward his courtiers became unpredictable. He suddenly drew some close, allowing them to sit at the foot of his bed and hold his hand, while others he ordered removed that same day and never allowed back into the palace. Several pages were sent home without explanation. It was later said that the king couldn't bear the sight of healthy, vigorous young men near him. Francis ceased to participate consistently in state affairs. He would sign an important decree only to demand its destruction an hour later because his thoughts were corrupted. Advisors began meeting without him, bringing documents only for signature, trying not to linger in his presence.
Power gradually shifted to his mother, Catherine de' Medici, who increasingly held meetings separately.
On July 20th, 1560, he suddenly forbade his courtiers from laughing in the corridors near his chambers. Any sound of mirth enraged him. One musician was sent away from the castle simply for tuning his instrument too loudly. The court, once full of conversation and footsteps, became almost silent. By the end of the month, even his wife, the young Queen of Scots, Mary Stuart, spent less and less time with him. Their meetings became brief and formal. Francis tired quickly, whether in bed or in conversation. He would lose the thread of a conversation and suddenly turn to the wall, as if forgetting who was there. On July 31st, 1560, the court physician recorded that the king was experiencing clouds of mind alternating with periods of clarity. During these moments of clarity, Francis attempted to speak about the war, religious conflicts, and the future of France. But after just a few minutes, he grew tired, closed his eyes, and asked to be left in silence. By this time, there was no longer talk at court about recovery. The only question was how long the young king's body and mind could withstand the illness. His presence still signified power, but power itself was beginning to exist independently of him. On August 1st, 1560, Francis II was found sitting against the wall of his bedroom, barefoot, wearing only a nightshirt. His gaze was blank, and his lips moved silently. According to his servants, he remained there for at least 3 hours, until his body began to tremble from the cold. After this incident, doctors confirmed that the signs of organic brain damage had become irreversible. But even his weakening mind did not prevent him from remaining a source of terror at court. The king no longer slept at night. He fell asleep during the day, sometimes on the floor, sometimes in a chair, forbidding anyone to touch him. He began to view his bed as a trap, and once tipped it over onto its side, leaving it there until dawn. After this, orders to rearrange the furniture became daily. He ordered tables, chairs, and curtains moved, claiming they were watching him. On August 4th, servants were forced to bring food in closed vessels because Francis had become wary of poison. He blamed the cooks, changed the dishes 3 times during dinner, and once threw everything on the tray into the fireplace. He didn't completely abstain from food, but he began eating not with his hands or utensils, but by licking the rims of his plates like an animal, refusing to allow anyone to look at him while he ate. No one dared meet his gaze, even accidentally. He no longer allowed doctors to see him. After one unsuccessful irrigation, which left him with severe chills and a nosebleed, Francis forbade even the mention of medicine. All medical instruments were removed from his chambers. He permitted only rub-downs with vinegar and honey, administered by deaf servants who could not speak. On August 13th, during a sudden seizure, he lost consciousness and hit his temple on a corner cabinet. Afterward, one eye began to water incessantly, and this irritated him more than the pain itself. He began wearing a bandage across his forehead, and crusts accumulated underneath it, which no one dared remove. The smell intensified, but no one complained. Those who had complained earlier had already been sent away. Francis began to drift away from reality. He confused names, dates, even his position. Sometimes he called himself a soldier, sometimes a shepherd. One evening on August 19th, he assured everyone he was in the castle of his youth and ordered a feast to celebrate a hunt that never took place. Servants were forced to set the table and arrange the dishes, while the king himself sat with his head bowed, slowly running his finger along the tabletop, as if reminiscing. The servants no longer tended him with ritual reverence. They performed their duties with detachment, quickly and silently. He began to be perceived not as a ruler, but as a heavy burden. Even his mother, Catherine de' Medici, visited less and less frequently, spending no more than a few minutes with him. She could not bear to watch her son fade away, slowly, absurdly, without majesty. By August 23rd, Francis's body had completely lost its former shape. He had lost weight, his shoulders had sagged, his face had become narrow and sharp, with inflamed skin and pigmentation spots. He no longer maintained his posture, his head constantly tilted to the side, as if under the weight of something internal. Servants propped him up under the armpits when he tried to walk into the corridor. One day, he sat by the window until dawn, completely soaked by the condensation that had settled on the glass. He didn't move, only tapping his finger on the windowsill, always in rhythm. After that, the windows were never opened again. On August 27th, 1560, his personal valet recorded in his journal that the king hadn't addressed anyone around him.
In the past 24 hours, he didn't eat, drink, or move. He just sat there, staring into space.
This silence was more frightening than all the screams he'd been rattling the court with in recent months. He became a symbol of vanishing power. He was no longer feared. He was pitied. But behind the pity came horror. The realization that the same thing could happen to the throne of France as happened to the king's body. And like his face, the country would soon cease to be recognizable. From September 1st, 1560, Francis II stopped getting up. His body no longer responded to commands, and attempts to sit him up in a chair resulted in him slowly sliding to the side, like a soft doll without a frame. He barely spoke. Only occasionally would he whisper something, but no one understood his words. They were jumbled, like the thoughts of a man who had already withdrawn into himself. Her breathing became ragged, with a characteristic wet wheeze that arose deep in her chest. Her face turned gray, her lips cracked, her eyes couldn't focus. Doctors recorded her body temperature unstable, her pulse weak and irregular. Everything pointed to the approaching end, but no one dared say it out loud. The courtiers continued to go through the motions as if anything could be changed. On September 5th, one of the maids noticed that the king's right hand was turning dark. His fingertips were blue, and his nails were gray. This was the first external sign of internal septic gangrene. Doctors later recognized that the infection had spread throughout the bloodstream, and his heart and lungs were no longer able to cope. The room where he lay was closed to all but 3 people: the doctor, the elderly valet, and the maid in charge of the linen. All 3 worked in shifts, silently, trying not to linger nearby. Their clothes absorbed the smell and had to be changed immediately after leaving. They did not touch the king with their bare hands. Vinegar-soaked cloths were the only barrier between them and the decomposing body.
On September 10th, 1560, Francis began to rave constantly.
He tossed and turned, clutched the edge of his bed, groaned and clawed at the pillows. One time, he injured his ear so badly that it began bleeding again. His head was stuck to the fabric, and in the morning, the bandages were removed along with his hair. His face increasingly resembled a mask. The flesh around his cheekbones had sunken. His eyes were sunken. He barely drank. His lips were dry and began to bleed. Any attempt to insert a spoonful of water resulted in a cramp in his throat. On September 13th, the skin on the back of my head began to peel. Doctors diagnosed this as the final stage of progressive tissue breakdown. From that day on, they stopped recording my temperature and pulse. They no longer had any purpose. Francis's last known interaction with others occurred on September 15th. He raised his hand and touched his valet's shoulder. His fingers trembled, his skin was cold, and he made no further movement. He died early in the morning of December the 5th, 1560, completely alone. His valet, entering the room, found his body cold, with his mouth half open and stained all over. Thin streams of turbid fluid oozed from his ears and nose. The pillow was soaked. The fabric yellowed from the moisture inside, which even the multiple layers of bandages couldn't contain. The sheet was stuck to his back, and to turn the body over, it had to be cut with a knife. By the time the official death was announced, the body emanated such a pungent odor that 3 layers of cloth soaked in a mixture of honey and herbs were used for transport, and some of the bearers still fainted. The coffin was sealed immediately, and none of the courtiers wished to be present during the preparation of the body for burial. This task was entrusted to village woodcarvers and monks. On the 19th, while being prepared for removal, part of the coffin began to darken from the inside. The swollen remains of the tissue released moisture, which seeped through the wood. The coffin had to be reinforced, wrapped with tarred ropes, and buried deeper than usual. The chronicle entry read, "The deceased rested in silence, deeper than was proper, and alone." Royal chroniclers barely mentioned the final weeks of his life. Official reports spoke of a sudden death after a prolonged fever, but private letters preserved other lines. The king passed away slowly, day by day, like food in a rotting vessel. Not glory accompanied his departure, but silence, like that of a damp cellar. Thus ended the brief and painful life of Francis II, a king whose death was not simply the end of youth, but a symbol of how decay can destroy not only the flesh, but also the idea of power. During his lifetime, the Château d'Amboise was considered the center of the French monarchy. After his death, it was described differently, a place where only the stench of the crown remained.